Ciao friends, welcome to another video from SQL BI. In this video, we're going to talk about scatterplots. A scatterplot can be a very effective visual if you use it correctly. For example, you can use it to have details in your report rise to the surface. These details are very important because it's what your users use in order to make decisions and take actions based on the information they see in your report. In this video, we'll explain what a scatterplot is, how to read and interpret one, as well as when you might use it and how you can use it by setting it up step by step in an example. Let's take a look at that example right now. In this report, we're looking at a very typical year-over-year sales analysis. We're looking at our sales for the current year compared to the previous year, with the year-over-year in value as well as in percent. We're doing a breakdown by product, as well as, if we drill down further, by region. We could use these breakdowns as well as sorting the data to see the bottom performers and the top performers to basically try to understand where we should focus. But this isn't very effective, even if we did format the table, because we're only seeing 10 rows at a time. We're not really seeing the numbers in a broader context, and it's taking us a long time to find the data points that we really need to act on. Now, let's compare that to the next report page. In the next page, we have a scatterplot on the left and a table on the right. In the scatterplot, we have the sales year over year, where the more behind products are on the left and the more ahead products are on the right. Each of these dots is representing a product, where the dots that are higher up have a higher target. Basically, we can see that there's a big group of products over here that have a very high sales previous year, but are also behind this year. That means that these are the products that we should be focusing on, and we see that immediately in this visual. We can immediately understand what the products are by hovering on them to get some more information in a tooltip, or benefiting from cross-filtering by just selecting them. We can hold Control and then select multiple dots at once, and we get that information in the supplemental table. Compared to the previous matrix, we can immediately have these details jump out at us because they're these dots in the top left of the report. These large red dots that are calling our attention, and it's very easy for us to either hover or click on them to get more information. In the next part of this video, we'll explain how to set this up for yourself, walking through step by step the basics of creating a scatterplot, as well as the formatting considerations and some more advanced things that you might want to try. If you want to set up a scatterplot in Power BI, it's very easy. You go to the Visualizations pane, and the scatterplot is a core visual type, which you have here. I can just select the scatter chart and then start adding my variables. I add two variables in a scatterplot, one for the x-axis and one for the y. I'm going to add the sales previous year, as well as the sales year over year, like was shown in the previous scatterplot. The year over year I have on the x-axis, and the previous year I have on the y. Right now, I only have one dot because I haven't yet added any categories. So I'm going to go ahead and add our products. We'll start by adding the product category, but we can also add the product name. We'll go ahead and do that to the actual scatterplot instead of a table here for the product category, and then the product name, so that we can be able to do a drill down, for example. So even with this simple scatterplot that we've made, we can see something that's standing out at us. We have a group of data points over here, and then an outlier up in the top left. This outlier is grouping away from the rest of the data, so it immediately calls to our attention. We can immediately see that the computer products are performing worse compared to the rest. This is something that might be really easy to see with another chart type, but once we start breaking this down to the individual product level, we wouldn't be able to see this. We would just see a sea of numbers. But in a scatterplot, we can still have these outliers and groups of data points stand out at us. Now, what if we wanted to compare by a different measure? For example, if we wanted to have margin instead of our sales previous year. Well, if we add margin, what we can immediately see is we have different clusters of data. We have high margin, medium margin, and low margin products. We can then do something else by adding a category, for example, to the legend. So we already saw that computers was interesting. So let's label computers using a category grouping that's already been prepared. We can see that our computers make up the bottom performers in all three margin categories. So we really need to focus on our computers. This is the kind of analysis that we can do with a scatter plot. It reveals patterns and trends in the data that we wouldn't otherwise be able to see using other visuals. It shows us the distribution, and it can show us sometimes a more complete picture. Now, what are the different types of a scatter plot that we would use? Well, if we go over to the tablet, we can see that there's 8 different types of scatter plots, at least that we'll talk about in this video. We have a standard scatter plot, where we just have a measure along the y-axis and a measure along the x-axis, and then we break this out by a specific category to see the distribution of the data points. This is the standard scatter chart that's useful for looking at things like distribution of data, outliers, clusters, these kind of things. An animated scatter plot is something that we can use using the play axis in Power BI. We can add, for example, months or years to be able to see how this trend is evolving. We can actually see these data points moving as we progress through these periods. So an animated scatter plot is good for us to be able to see how this distribution is changing over time or over specific categories. A bubble plot, on the other hand, allows us to be able to not only use the y and the x-axis, but also an additional measure to be able to compare the size of the dots. This is very helpful if we want to have a third measure to be able to do the comparison, or if we want to highlight particularly important data points. For example, we might want to use the margin to call attention to the higher margin products because they'll be bigger, so the user is more likely to look at those larger dots first. So a bubble plot can be particularly useful when we have a third measure that we want to add into that analysis. A quadrant plot is a standard type of scatter plot where we have the data broken out into quadrants. This is very useful when we want to do a segmentation. For example, we want to identify which products are performing the best, which products are performing the worst, do a kind of grouping or segmentation of our products or our customers. So a quadrant plot is particularly useful for that. The next type of scatter plot is a volcano plot, and we've already been talking and creating a volcano plot. It's my personal favorite because it allows us to be able to do comparisons. So with a volcano plot, along the x-axis, we have a measure that indicates some kind of change, for example, year over year, or before and after some kind of event, like a marketing action, looking at the sales of stores before and after to see if it's plus or minus. And it allows us to be able to identify things that are performing poorly, things that are performing positively, so that we can identify the bottom performers and the top performers, more easily focus on those, where we have our target along the y-axis. Now, a volcano plot has a great many use cases, and it's the one that we'll talk about the most in this particular video and article. These first 5 scatter plots we can all make with the core visual in Power BI. The next 3 we can only use with custom visuals, like Deneb, for example. The first of them is a connected scatter plot. It's like the animated scatter plot, but it's not animated, basically. But we can still see the evolution of these data points, for example, over a period. So it's something that's useful if we have a small number of data points and we're just looking at how they change over time. A good example of this is if we have our product categories, or we just have a few different categories, like 3 or 4, and then we want to see how those have evolved over the last few years, how that distribution has changed. For example, we saw computers, we saw it was performing quite poorly, and we want to understand if that's been the case for the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, how that distribution looks. So a connected scatter plot could be interesting for something like this. A joint plot is the standard scatter plot, but it has an additional smaller graph along the x and the y-axis to give us a higher resolution of the distribution of the data along these 2 axes. So it's particularly useful when it's very important for us to understand on a more fine grain how this distribution is comparing between these two axes. That's what a joint plot is, and there's a lot of different variants of joint plots that we can use. A good way to do this is in Python. So if you want to use the Python custom visual, for example, using Seaborn, the library package Seaborn is very useful for doing this. Very easy. So the last one isn't explicitly a scatterplot. It just looks like a scatterplot, but it's worth mentioning because it has a single axis. So we have a single measure. And then we have on the x-axis actually two categories that we want to compare. We're comparing A and B, and we're comparing their distribution, and we just have what's known as a jitter. So there's a bit of a jitter along the x-axis, so the data points are not overlapping 100%. And in this case, for example, we could have an average. So let's say we have an average. If we were just looking at the average in a bar chart, they might look like they were the same. But when we're looking at the individual data points in a swarm plot, we can better understand the distribution, not only to identify outliers, but also to get a general sense of how that distribution compares. We can more easily see how these two categories compare to one another. So it gives us more of a complete picture compared to when we just use a simple bar chart or aggregated analysis. So these last three are more complicated examples of scatter plots, more specific with specific use cases. They're still very useful to know. And the other five we can all make using the core visual in Power BI. It's useful to know about the different types of scatter plots because you might have different use cases depending on the data you're working with or the report you're creating. Nonetheless, scatter plots are definitely a useful chart type, and it's definitely useful to know how you can make one for yourself. So let's zoom in specifically on the volcano plot and try to make this all the way from A to Z, even including all the different formatting options. So where we left off was we had the beginnings of a volcano plot. We had the basics already laid out where a user could drill up and down between product category and product name. We're going to flesh this out a little bit more, add some formatting, and that formatting is going to serve two purposes. First of all, we want to make sure that users can more easily read and understand what they're looking at. For a lot of people, this will be their first time seeing a scatter plot if it's not something we've already used. So we need to make sure that people really understand it, that they can use it. This is particularly important if they're used to looking at tables and matrices. This is something that you can do in a training, or you can do it in the kind of weekly office hours. Otherwise, it's a good idea if you have some formatting that explains the chart, or a separate report page that walks through how to use the visual in a GIF or in a label diagram. So that's the first point. And the second point is that you want to make sure that the formatting makes the chart more effective, so that people immediately are drawn to the data points that they should be paying attention to. So you want to make sure you leverage the conditional formatting options to be able to do that. So let's start there. What we're first going to do is we're going to create a title. We'll just call this product sales year over year, and we'll give it a more readable font and font size, adding a subtitle. We want to say each dot is a product name, so that's clear for everybody who looks at this. Make it a bit more subtle so it doesn't steal too much attention, and add a divider just for a little bit of space. I think that's fine. Maybe a little bit more padding, and then we're good. So the next thing we want to do is we want to have some lines. We're going to add 3 lines. Only one of these is actually going to be a line. It'll be your 0 line. So this is going to be a very functional line because everything left of this line is bad. Everything right of this line is good. So it's something that's very important. So we will make it black so it's a little bit more legible. And 33 transparency, and we don't need to label it. The next 2 lines are actually going to be labels. So what we want to do is we want to insert a label here and here that says behind target and ahead of target respectively. And that's just to make it easier for users again. We'll call this behind target. We'll call this ahead of target. Gotta love it. Ahead of target. Okay. We're going to position these lines. We're going to do it manually, but you could, of course, do this using conditional formatting by specifying the maximum value. So, but we'll just do it manually for now. And we're going to put this at around 1,500,000 with 100% transparency, so the line disappears. That's critical. We're basically making the line disappear because we only want the data label. We turn on the data label, we only want the name, and then we're going to put the name underneath. So, and then we want to label it black. And we do the same thing for the other line. So 100% transparency, negative 1,500,000. And then turn on the data label below name, make it red, let's say. So it says behind target, and we'll put it to the right so that it's a bit balanced. So then that way we have our labels on the left and the right side. So just a little trick in order to get some labels where we want. Again, we should be using some more conditional formatting in order to do this. That will help make sure that it's more flexible according to filtering and slicing and so on. But this is just to demonstrate the technique. So what we want to do next is we'll just make our axes a little bit more subtle, just reduce the color a little bit, just so that they're not stealing too much attention. Because we want the attention to be on the data points. So we're just making these a little bit less dark. We'll do the same thing with our title. Okay. And then we're going to add some conditional formatting. So we're going to conditionally format our dots so that we have everything in the middle will be gray, everything above will be black, everything below will be red. And we'll put this at 0. We'll use sales year over year. And so this just helps draw attention to the data points that are most behind, so that the red data points that draws attention, it also has a negative indication. We can turn off the legend because we have these labels down here. So the legend is just taking up space, so it can be confusing. And if we wanted to, we could choose between having a fill or using a border if we wanted to, but we'll leave it as a fill for now. And we'll make this a little bit bigger. So the last thing we'll do is we'll make our sales previous year. We already have that, but we're going to go ahead and add that also in size, because if we reduce the size a little bit, so we'll make it like -26 or something. So this way, it's a little subtle way of drawing more attention to these data points at the top because they're a little bit bigger than these data points down here. However, there might still be a reason that people want to investigate these data points, like this one here or that one there. If they want to do that, a good way to enable that is you can enable these zoom sliders. So you can have the zoom slider along, I recommend to do it along the x-axis mainly. Then that way the user has complete control over zooming in on these data points. So, and if you had it on the y-axis as well, so then you could also zoom in like this. So then they could zoom into those individual data points. So that is possible, so that they get a little bit more control. However, it does clutter it up a little bit because you can't control yet the formatting of these things. So it's something to be aware of. So a zoom slider is a nice option for a bit more flexibility. So that is, in a nutshell, how you create the volcano plot. So you start by just setting the values that you want on the x and y axis. The value on the x-axis is some kind of comparison. Typically, things on the left are going to be more behind. Things on the right are going to be, more positive, more ahead. And then your y-axis will be the target. And then you can identify, the important data points by adding some conditional formatting. For instance, you want to have the line for a functional purpose to be able to really separate good and bad. And you can also add some, subtle cues, things like a title to more make it clearer for users and so on. So, but you don't have to conditionally format the markers this way. What you could also do is we're going to just remove the formatting now. You could also label this by a category. So we had, for instance, a grouping of our categories because computers was so interesting for us. So if we label this by computers, for instance, and we'll go ahead and add the legend back now. So computers are really accounting for a huge proportion of everything that is behind compared to last year, if we compare it to everything else. We can make this even more evident if we change the shape of the other, just make them a bit more subtle with an X. And then we also change the color so that computers are red and the other is gray. We can really see that computers are accounting for a tremendous amount of our gap. We don't have to conditionally format by a measure. We could also conditionally format by a category. We just want to keep in mind that if we do that, it can get out of hand very quickly. So if, for example, we add our category here, product category, we already have a lot of different categories. And while we can identify computers, and we can identify some value here and seeing, some other category here, TV and video. So when we get to down here, I mean, it's just a colorful mess. So it's important to keep in mind that once you go beyond 3, 4, or 5 categories, you're not going to be getting a whole lot of value from doing that, but it is an option. So what really becomes interesting when you're using the scatter plot, however, is when you start using it in combination with cross-filtering. Because as demonstrated earlier, what you can do is when you select a data point, it immediately gives you those details in the other table, so in the other visuals. And this is just a native functionality of Power BI. So this is something that becomes extremely interesting because it's so obvious. You hover for some, supplemental information, and then you just control select to be able to do the filtering. So if I want to know what these data points are, I can just click on them. And that's very easy. And we can take this up a notch by having 2 different volcano plots. So in this case, we have one for products, one for regions, specifically state. And when we select a dot in one, it filters the other. So that way I can see for this product, which states are having the biggest problems. So for instance, our product that's most behind, we actually have one state that's really doing well, Ontario, classic Canada. And then we have some states that are really underperforming, and we can immediately find out what those are. We can do this also in the opposite direction. So if we deselect here, we want to know this state, Ontario, we want to know why it's doing so well. We can, look at those products they're doing very well, also the products that are not doing as well, and vice versa, to be able to really see the states that are underperforming. So we can select it and then be able to zoom in on the products. So cross-filtering is one way to make your scatter plots more flexible, particularly when you're cross-filtering between scatter plots. But we could take that even further. Using calculation groups and field parameters, you can also get a whole new range of flexible options. Field parameters allow you to be able to dynamically select both dimensions and measures, and you can incorporate these in your scatter plots in all kinds of different ways. In combination with cross-filtering, it gives a whole range of flexible options to be able to make very exploratory analyses, which are particularly helpful when you have advanced users or data that needs to be looked at from all kinds of different points of view. Let's look at a quick example. In this example, we have 4 different field parameters. First, 2 that have been created for different dimensions, dynamically selecting how we're breaking out the data and how we're coloring it. And then 2 field parameters that are controlling both the y-axis as well as the x-axis. This allows us to be able to, for instance, change the axis so we're looking at it in a different direction, or even incorporating different measures like looking at the margin, coloring this in a different way, or even breaking it out by different categories. If we're looking at it by subcategory, brand, and so on. It's important to keep in mind when you're doing this kind of very flexible analysis that you don't just want to throw the whole thing. You want to make sure that you have it a bit more intentionally designed so it's not overwhelming for users. It's also important that you make sure that your users can best leverage this kind of more advanced scenario so they're trained to know how they should use the different options and more importantly, how they should interpret what they're looking at. To summarize, scatterplots can be a very effective and interesting visual type to use. It can help you highlight details in your report by showing things like outliers or groups of data points, and there's different types of scatterplots that you can use for different situations. If you want to try to create a scatterplot, one interesting one you might try is a volcano plot, which helps you be able to compare a before and after situation, for example, in a year-over-year analysis, so that users can more easily identify specific data points that they can focus on, and you can help them do that with conditional formatting and make their analysis more flexible by using cross-filtering, as well as even field parameters in advanced scenarios. Enjoy DAX.